All right, everybody. And so here we are for the last talk of the day. We have Ripley here, and we are going to be talking about upgrading the Retrocade and modding and streaming with vintage electronics. Do remember that all the discussion and Q&A is happening in our Discord. There's a link below the stream. And once you get in, it takes a minute to get your roles, but it's all automated, so you should be all set. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ripley, and it's all yours.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Ripley, and I am a streamer here on Twitch at RipleyViolet. You can find me on Twitter at RipleyStorm. So we're going to talk a little bit about vintage electronics today. Emulators are a really amazing way to play games, especially if you have a bunch of old games. But there are some limitations with emulators. I mean, in some cases, streaming platforms don't want you to play games that you haven't already paid for. In some cases, companies that put out the games don't want you playing games that you haven't paid for. And everybody knows that, for backup purposes, you definitely always have, a couple backup copies of your game. However, in the 16-bit world, especially with a lot of old ROMs and emulators that have been around since the days of LimeWire when everybody was getting massive viruses, there are usually a lot of breakdowns that happen in a lot of old game ROMs. So one of the things that I've always kind of focused on doing is I've been modding vintage electronics since the early 2000s and have done a lot of vintage repairs. This is the NEC Turbo Duo, which the TurboGrafx 16 was very, very popular in Japan as the PC engine. We're going to be going through a mod and a repair on the PC engine here earlier, but this is basically the old system from 1993 that I'm going to be talking about today. You're going to have to pardon the shakiness in my voice. I'm not usually used to presenting on other people's channels, but I do appreciate the DEFCON First for having me here, and I appreciate all of you for coming and watching today. So why focus on old games? Why focus on old gaming systems? Well, the thing about an old gaming system is that if you play on vintage hardware and you play on vintage electronics, you're getting the original experience from how the game was originally supposed to be intended to be played. In many cases, emulators, especially when being played on plasma screen and LCD TVs, have a thing called upscaling. Now, upscaling may sound like a good thing, but in reality, what it does is it takes old pixel art and literally washes it out and takes away all of the corners on the edges. It removes scan lines, which is a very, very, very important thing. If y'all are into vaporwave and retrowave, you know how like all the art has all these lines that go through everything, like these old scan lines? That's because it's trying to emulate the idea of being broadcast on an old CRT or PVM studio monitor. So I have an old PVM studio monitor, an old Trinitron from the early 1990s, that I'm currently running and broadcasting all of my vintage electronic stuff off of. Now, that means that I have to have a SCART cable coming out of the back running to one of the IDE extension ports on the back. And in this case, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that I have original broadcast quality from a CRT monitor when I'm exporting to a video card that goes directly into my computer. Now, another thing that you have to worry about, especially if you're dealing with an old system, is does the system have what's called RGB? Now, RGB is quite simply like, I'm going to bring up an old chip. I'm just going to show this to you for just a second. An old RGB chip is literally about the size of a quarter. What it does is it splits the red, green, and blue signal directly from the monitor so that you get true color exporting and you get crisp, clean colors on the outside of the system. So when you're looking at how these are supposed to be set up, this is an RGB chip that's been installed on a PC Engine Duo. Now, you can see how the lines have been color-coded for red, green, and blue so that the video signal is split. You can also see on how on the HU 6260 chip, which is the graphics chip, one of two 8-bit chips. Now, another thing about the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo Duo is that it's technically, people argue that it's not a true 16-bit system because it had two side-by-side 8-bit chips. This doesn't matter. Arguing over purity is not what I'm talking about here. I want to show you how what you basically have to do to split a signal. And this is something that, actually I sent to somebody to repair for me after I used wires that were too thick. Also, make sure as you can see down here in the corner. I'm not sure if my mouse is being broadcast, but these 3 purple wires are about 18 to 22 gauge. You're going to want to make sure that you have really small gauge wires and not like this yellow wire here, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 to 10 gauge. You want to make sure that like when you have everything set up, you have a small enough area and small enough workspace to work with. And when you're putting your capacitors in, it's okay to do a little bit of trace relocation and folding down if, and it's not going to look 100% pretty, but if you're replacing, the capacitors in an old system, I always recommend to people, whenever you do capacitors, get NGK high temps. Now, why would I want to get a high temp capacitor to put in an old video game system? Well, if you're going for speed running and you're trying to beat a record, sometimes you might leave your computer system on while you run to the 7-Eleven or whatever to get a cup of coffee and then come back. In many cases, long-term running on a system, especially with an old power supply, can cause capacitors to overheat and then sometimes pop and then leak electrolytic fluid all over a board. You can see on this board here in the bottom right corner, there were some damaged traces as a result of electrolytic fluid leaking out on the bottom of the chipboard. This is a really common thing. You can use a toothbrush, some high intensity alcohol, and make sure that you have a very fine, thin cloth to dampen it up. You can also use compressed air, but in some cases, compressed air, if used too liberally, can end up damaging traces itself. You'd be surprised at how much 20 psi on an old burnt copper trace can do. So taking a look at basically like how this works, relocating chips and capacitors, when you pull apart your system, you're going to have a lot of leftover stuff. I usually use an old shot glass to take all of the old capacitors. And as you can see, a lot of vintage electronics, especially from the early 90s in the 16-bit gaming era, all had these silver cap capacitors that were made and actually made incorrectly. And so there's been an issue with a lot of these leaking. And so in many cases, I always tell people, go for an SMD option. I'll show you all a couple SMD options here in just a couple minutes. Go for an SMD option when recapping your system, or go for something, an NTK high temp cap, so that you don't have to worry about it dying on you 10 or 15 years or 5 years down the road. This is an all too common thing for people to have to worry about. So when you're going through all these systems, you're going to want to make sure you look around the heat sinks, because the heat sink area is going to be where a lot of your damage is going to occur. If you could see here, we're going to zoom in a little bit. If you can see here, around the areas of the heat sinks, all the capacitors have been replaced. The reason why the capacitors have all been replaced is because this high heat area, which is right by the power supply, which is down bottom over on the left, causes a lot of damage on the inside of the system. So make sure that, like, when you go through everything, you replace all your caps, do it right, do it once. Make sure that you scrape back to the trace. Be careful with it. Use small tweezers and don't go too crazy with it, because if you do, you don't want to leave your soldering iron on a chipboard and have you burn through and then have to send it to somebody and burn out a $300 system. That's not something that I ever would want anyone to ever have to worry about. So in some cases, when you're looking at old transistors, you're dealing with like really tiny components. This is an SMD cap that we were installing just to replace actually an LED in the system, so that you could see even a power on light. The system didn't actually come with a power on light, so I had to take a 3-way transistor and run it through and tap a power source just to be able to get a light on. So then what I did was I drilled a hole through the front of the system and popped the LED through that area, and then ran it directly from the AC power source. Another thing that you're going to want to remember about these old systems is that the old power sources are unique to every system. So, for example, we're going to take a look here at over at the corner. This is the AV output for the for the PC Engine that I was talking about. Now, let's talk for a second about power supplies. When you have a power supply for your system, it's always important to make sure that you find an AC adapter that has the right voltage and the right milliamperage. There's this joke that's going around the internet that old Sega Genesis AC adapters can be used on every 16-bit console. This is not true. While all of them have 12 amps, the 16-bit Sega Genesis AC adapter that you can find anywhere at any vintage computer shop or any vintage video game shop has a milliamperage of between 1600 and 1800 milliamps. What does this mean? This means that you will jack your voltage from 12 to 13.6 or 13.8 volts, and you can fry out a lot of stuff on the inside of your system. Now, this is something that I've dealt with a lot of times before. What you usually end up happening is right at the area where your power input comes from your AC adapter, you'll see a break in the solder, and you'll usually have 2 or 3 or 4 broken capacitors, or maybe even if the voltage got too hot, it might burn through a trace. This is something that I've dealt with a lot of times before. I always tell people, yes, I can go in and repair the system for you, but I want you to throw that AC adapter away, give it to somebody with a 16-bit Sega Genesis, or simply build your own power supply. You can even use a universal adapter if you just play the game on like a semi-regular basis, but that's going to be like the most important thing that you're going to need to do. So taking a look at this old system here, it has one video output. Now, this video output is, you can see it has two little switches. This is from back in the day of those old butterfly line AV adapters that hopped in on the back of old black and white TVs and those tiny little CRTs that you would get in the early 1980s. This is a holdover from the early 1980s technology of the Atari 2600, of the Vectrex, and of the Odyssey 2 and the Intellivision. So what did I have to do? I had to take this 16-bit, this 8-bit system, this PC Engine from 1987, which I pulled apart and ran through a system called Retrobrite. Retrobriting is a process in which you use hydrogen peroxide, xanthan gum, and a few other things to brighten up the console back to its original color state. After I had done that, I removed all the electronics on the inside of the system and started work on the video output and tapping in the video chip. So as I installed the video chip for the system, I once again used wires that were too large. But I pulled out the HuCard slot from the NEC system to kind of illustrate to you how you have to set these things up and how it's important to color code all of your electronics before you do an RGB install. So basically, this was a lot of work. This was basically switching pins left and right and installing a switch on the other side so that you could play Japanese and American games. This was also, there was also the second chip that I showed you earlier where you take the RGB signal and you split it 3 ways. So what we're doing is we're basically setting this old system up so that it can play virtually any game that's been released on the HuCard platform via a switch, and also is splitting the RGB signal so that it can be played on an old Sony PVM, which then can be exported via a SCART cable directly to a video export card. Now, video export cards are a really important part of streaming. If you're going to be streaming off of vintage electronics, you're going to want to have a really high-end video export card. And if you go stream with old vintage electronics like this in the 16-bit and the 8-bit era, you're going to want to make sure that you have either a SCART input or an AV input on the outside of the SCART. Now, what does that mean? In some cases, you can find a SCART cable like this that will export directly to the red, yellow, and white AV inputs. You can also, in some cases, find them exporting to an S-video input. You can also find them, in some cases, exporting to an IDE input. Now, as there are different setups that you can have for different things. Like, because I'm running all vintage electronics, and because I was running SCART, I ran into a lot of issues when I was doing this install. First of all, you have to make sure whoever sold you the SCART cable, if you didn't build it yourself, has the pinout done correctly. Because there's a difference between EuroSCART and JP16. What's the difference between EuroSCART and JP16? Well, European PVM monitors and Japanese PVM monitors are coded differently and usually have 1 or 2 pins that are off, slightly off center. So what you have to do is you have to usually, by trial and error, plug the cable in through your setup and then figure out what your video signal looks like. Now, in this case, I was playing Keith Courage and Alpha Zones, which in Japan is known as Wataru. And I plugged it in and everything was completely and totally blue. Now, did I understand why everything was blue? Well, it meant that one of the other two signals wasn't coming through correctly. So what I had to do was I had to figure out which one of the wires coming off of the chip was actually not sending correctly down to the signal. So I had to go back through again a second time and I switched it around. And then what ended up happening? Well, only the red signal was broadcasting, which meant that I didn't really have any green or didn't have any blue. So then what I did was I switched everything around and went back to the original pinout design and plugged everything in. And the whole video system process went screwy. So what did I do? I basically looked back at the cable. I traced back all of the images and I traced back all of the traces back to where they should have been on the RGB plug. Again, what ended up happening was, if you look over here, this area here, right? You see how there's one space between the red and the green? So what basically ended up happening here was the red cable was directly above the green cable, and I had to relocate it one pin out over because it was wired for Euroscart and needed to be wired for JP16. That's literally the only difference that it needed to have. So again, making sure that your leads are going correctly and that your broadcast output is going correctly is something that you're going to want to have. So what did I do with this system? What did I do on the inside of this system that made it so important? Well, in pulling it apart, I kind of had to take a look at the inside of the electronics and figure out what was still working and what wasn't still working. In this case, the ribbon cable had been so heated up so many times and so broken, what ended up happening was it snapped clean off. And it really drove me kind of crazy because I pulled the thing apart and realized that I was working with this cable that was like 25 years old, and newer printer cables probably would have been a better replacement. But because there was so much of it inside, because they literally had so much of it on the inside of it, I was able to eliminate half of the cable and all of the breaks from the cable, and then strip it on the top end, you can see here, so that it came back together. Now, after a whole bunch of tedious soldering and a bunch of repair work that I care to never do again, I took all, I think, gosh, how many? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, all 60 pins on this, and soldered them back in individually with a low intensity heat iron and a needle point tip on my weller. This was not something that I ever cared to do again, like I said, but to make the system work correctly, that's what it took. You can also see over on the right, there's an NGK capacitor, which literally controls the power input for every single one of these pins. And what this does is this connector here powers everything on the inside of the system. So as you're going through and doing the rebuilding, this is something that you have to make sure is connected and you have to make sure is working correctly. So over the course of the repairs, I made sure to double check with a multimeter to make sure that the amperage and the voltage and the resistance was working correctly on the input slot. The input slot ended up being okay. We ended up being able to salvage the cable just by cutting enough of it back. As you can see, I did not do the best job in stripping all of the wires, but I was under a bit of a time crunch, and this is my personal unit, so I wasn't really too worried about making anybody angry about the internals of their system. So over the course of what it ended up look like when I ended up getting it installed, well, this is how it ended up looking towards the end. The Hue card slot was reinstalled via the new cable. The power region switch is what you see above it in the orange and purple cables. That region switch allows you to switch back and forth between the Japanese Hue card. Installed right there is Shubibinman #1, which is better known as Shockman in the United States. It was released as Shockman 2, or Shockman 3 was released on the Turbo Duo and is considered to be a really important game. You can see in the background my virtually indestructible keyboard and my incredibly messy desk. Whenever you have a repair project like this, it's not uncommon to get a whole bunch of flux and soldering junk and all sorts of little burn holes everywhere. You have to be prepared to get dirty whenever you do a repair like this, folks. It's just part of the nature of the beast, as it were. And here I am, this purple tiger, telling you about all this. Anyway, so let's take a look here real quick. This is pulled from the old PC Engine, site, which is now down. I pulled this years ago. This is a full capacitor guide that was done by somebody named Red Ghost. It lists everything and lists all the capacitor values. It's really good before you do an install to find a chart like this, because and again, I pulled these images directly from the PC Engine website forum that I used to be a member of many years ago and is now closed. All images are respective of the owners and of the people that created these charts. Without the people that created these charts, we got to give it up to the people like Red Ghost who did all of this kind of stuff, because they're the ones who made modders like me able to do my work. And these guys are very important. Always important to give credit to the people who created the materials. So again, as you look at kind of the installs and how these installs work on the inside of everything, we're now looking at to see how the video chip, the RGB chip, is installed. Now over on the right, you can see where I pulled that old video connector, like the old Atari 2600-bit video connector right here. We pulled that out and we've installed a 10-pin connector over on the right. Now what this 10-pin connector over on the right does is it receives the RGB signal The 10-pin connector on the right then goes into the end of the SCART cable, which is then exported to the TV like this. The SCART cable is then actually connected to yet another adapter, which then runs to the IDE cable that goes onto the back of the portable video monitor. But this is how to pull pure RGB directly to a CRT monitor. Now, from the CRT monitor, then what you have to do is you have to export the signal in true RGB from the machine that has scan lines on it, right? So that you get the pure video quality, those clunky, pixel art animations that have pure RGB color, so that you have the best broadcast quality that's then going to go out over the internet pipeline and onto somebody's plasma screen. But without all of this hardware, without doing all of these steps, and without running it through the original work, you're not going to be able to get this vintage feel. You're not going to be able to get this original pure broadcast quality that people couldn't even get back in the early 90s. The modder community that figured all of this stuff out literally gave people a video and audio upgrade that in many cases wasn't even understood back in the early 1980s. But because of large connectors on old systems like the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and the TurboGrafx 16, it opened up, by creating pathways for all of these things in the future, it opened up the ability for people to export the video the way that it was. So again, what are we doing here? We're taking a vintage piece of electronics, we're upgrading it so that it has the purest version of the video possible. We're piping it through a vintage CRT so that it gets the best video quality possible, and then piping it directly again into a video export card. Is this a waste of time, Ripley? Well, no, actually it's not. If you actually look at how much people are spending on something called like a FrameMeister, FrameMeister was a company that I think stopped making stuff about 4 or 5 years ago. If you go in and buy something like a FrameMeister, you're going to spend $400, $500, $600 on a system that's literally going to emulate what all of these chips do, what all of these what all of these video chips do, and what all of these audio chips do. You're going to be losing so much quality. Again, it would be like the difference between looking at this video here and saying, I can't see the scan lines, right? Because I took it from a phone on a really shitty CRT, and this was like a flip phone, a camera flip phone. It wasn't even a smartphone that I took a photo of. That's the loss of video quality that you will experience if you run a vintage game like Wataru or Keith Courage directly from an emulator and pipe it onto a plasma screen without any sort of graphic rendering. I don't want to say that it cheapens the experience. I want to say that it's lossy. It's like an MP3 versus a WAV file. It's like an MP3 versus a FLAC file. It literally takes away so much of the original experience that it actually takes away the aesthetic pleasure, the audio pleasure, and the video pleasure of the game, and will actually bore you quicker, because you won't be able to see, the clunky little sound effects. You won't be able to see the little explosions as brightly. You won't be able to see like the little bits and pieces, or maybe the Easter eggs that have been written in to the graffiti on the back of a wall in a game like River City Ransom. All of these things are little Easter eggs that in some cases, by doing a mod like this and bringing the true color out, and bringing the true graphic quality out, and bringing the true audio quality out of a system is what makes the experience so special. And also, if you get a chance to play games on an old system like this, right? This is the TurboGrafx 16 Duo that's all pulled apart, running on a Sony, that's running on pure scan lines. You can see we've already got a loss of video quality because, again, it's taken from a camera flip phone. You have the experience of being able to play it on the original hardware as it was intended to be played. In some cases, if you're using a keyboard on an emulator, you might be moving too fast, or the inputs may be moving too quick, or you may be you may not have like the correct hand position that allows you to get that high score or get that high record. If you play on an old vintage game controller that has the actual response time directly from the input signal that goes directly into the system, that goes directly into the hue card, you get an actual or cartridge or CD or whatever your game medium is. You're getting the direct response of the game as it was originally intended to be played. And when you have that controller in your hands and you look at that game, which may be like a $5 game like this one, you're getting that original experience. You're getting the original experience the way the developers wanted you to have it, the way that the people who created the game wanted you to have it, and the way that all the speedrunners play the the game, because like in many cases, like when people do, when people either speedrun games or go for high scores or on vintage video game forums, you want to be using original hardware. This is the same reason why, like if you play Tekken 3 professionally, they don't let you use anything other than a regular PlayStation controller. You can't use your Scuff Gaming controller. You can't use your Turbo controller. You have to use the original controller, because that puts you at a level playing field for all of the people that are playing Tekken 3 with you. So when you're going for an old score, like on, say, for example, Shabibin Man, Shockman 1, I like this game because you can also play as the girl character, and that was like in 1987, which is pretty rad. You basically have this original experience and are being brought to the exact level of the person, who either set the speedrun record or played the original game or programmed the original game. Again, if you're using old hardware like this, you don't have to worry about a 30-year-old ROM corrupting in like the middle of level 8 and you losing your entire score. You don't have to worry about pulling a video game image of the original save file, which may have like a corruption somewhere, which could take you all the way to the end of the game and then crap out on you. Again, this is why I keep telling people, if you're going to go for old systems like this, make sure to use high temperature capacitors, because then you could run the system all day long. And granted, it's not great for it, right? But you're going to have way less of a risk of popping a capacitor, and you're going to be able to turn off your turn off your video monitor, and in some cases, maybe even remove a few peripherals, so that you don't knock something around and lose the game. I've left games on for about 24 hours when I've had to like leave or something and come back and then beaten them. That's how I beat Gate of Thunder, the first game. That way, and that's just a way to do it. Again, so the experience here is something that we're trying to emulate. We're not going to use an emulator here. We're literally trying to give you the original experience for vintage electronics. And again, it doesn't have to be a TurboGrafx 16. It can be a Sega Genesis, a Super Nintendo. It could be a WonderSwan. It could be a Neo Geo. I'm using this one because I really love this game system. I don't think that it gets enough exposure. Everybody will show you their Game Boy or their Game Gear or their Genesis or their SNES. I want to show people new stuff. I want to show people stuff that, like, I'm interested in, and also will be able to get people like really excited about old games. And as I keep going through all of this, like I look at, I look at all these old game systems. Another thing that I always do with all these old game systems is that I always replace the laser. Because half the time, the issues that you have is like, for example, is an old Hop M3 laser, which at one point you could get in Ohio for about $6. They would ship them to you directly from Japan. Once all these old video game system tutorials came up and people started doing all of their own modding, they sold completely out. All the Japanese stock went completely gone, and people started going on Alibaba and having people repop the Hop M3. And in one case, a Japanese manufacturer actually started repopping these lasers because people started getting so rancorous about restoring all of the old systems so that they could just play them on vintage electronics in their homes. Now, this was before streaming got really big. This was back in the Justin TV days, right? When people were like still talking about this, but nobody was really doing it. Nowadays, you don't see too many people broadcasting on vintage hardware. But I think that vintage hardware broadcasting is really cool, and I think it's something that people should at least attempt if they're an old school gamer like I am, gamer with a Y. Also, like, this is the laptop that I did most of my research on. This is a 2001 Dell Inspiron running Linux Mint 4.0 Darinia, and my StreamBot runs on a Python app, which runs off of this old laptop, which is now 20 years old. The entire time that I was doing repair work on all of these systems, this was the machine that I was broadcasting everything from. I mean, like, and by broadcasting, I use this term very, 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 very lightly, right? We're literally just using this to pull information from. But I mean, this is the level of nerdy that you have to kind of get to start really appreciating and really enjoying all of these old systems. So again, we're talking about upgrading video. We're talking about upgrading audio. We're talking about splitting signals. We're talking about playing stuff on old vintage hardware. Why would I want to invest this much money in an old system? Well, in many cases, you can get a broken system for 20 or 30 or 40 bucks, or at least you used to be able to. Now, that beats paying $250 for a new system, right? Or a vintage system on eBay. If you do your own repair work, there's a sense of self-satisfaction that you will have when you finish it and complete it. And you'll say, I did this. And not only are you going to say, I did this, I hacked this. This is hardware hacking, folks. When you go through and make something better than it originally was intended to be, using upgraded things like capacitors and chips that are created by, genius level individuals who literally like used to work as engineers and have nothing better to do than make their own video game systems better. This is literally what hardware hacking is. You're going through and you're bypassing all the problems in the system and making it so much better, so that now it can not only be used and broadcast directly for directly into a system like OBS, because use OBS, right? If you're this into your stuff, you're going to be using OBS instead of Streamlabs or something like that. Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Kitty Fangs. And then we'll be able to start taking questions here pretty soon. I'm going to just go over a couple things with like something like how this relates to PSPs, because I know I mentioned that in my description. And then I'm going to talk about just for a second why, again, being able to stream on vintage hardware like this is really, really important. So again, what are you doing? You're taking all of the old territory and all of the old stuff from back in the day, and you're taking an old system like this and you're bringing it up to modern standards. You're playing it on the original hardware, and you're looking at the original 1990s aesthetic. You're getting the original reaction time from the 2-button controller. You're getting, you're using all the original strategies. You're playing it as it was originally intended to be played. What does this give you other than street cred? The original experience for the game in the early 1990s. Can I just not listen to anything that you've ever said and just discount the last 30 minutes of you rambling about vintage electronics and just go get an emulator and download MAME and play something else because I don't have the game, or because I do have the game and I don't want to set everything up, or like because my system doesn't work? Yes, you can do that. But think about it this way. Between the audio, the video, the feel of the controller, the actual setup that you have, the second screen that's being broadcast, the scan lines, the R, the G, the B, and in some cases the upgraded audio setup, you're getting 30% of the experience. No wonder people with a Raspberry Pi that have 20,000 Nintendo games get so bored quickly, because they just don't know what to play, because they have every game, first of all. Second of all, because it's accessible in just a split second via loading a new file. And third of all, in many cases, it's downscaled, both audio and video, and you're playing on a computer keyboard. You're not getting the original experience. Hey, am I talking crap about the emulator scene? No, I think it's great. I think it has a place. I think it's really, really, really important. And I think it opens up the world of vintage gaming and also the world of vintage electronics to people. But I'm taking things a logical step further, and I'm showing you how you can take this vintage tech and use very simple upgrades with some simple soldering techniques, following a few instruction guides. In many cases, on vintage gaming forums, these chips are available for people for $30 or $40. So think about it. You buy a broken system for $20, $30. You buy a chip for $30. You buy another chip for $20, and you buy some, capacitors and some soldering stuff. You literally just spent $100 on a system that you totally hot rodded, that now has SCART, RGB, great audio, great video quality, and can be hooked up to virtually any old system, any old CRT, any old vintage Trinitron, any old vintage monitor. And you're going to be getting the perfect experience. How much time does this take? 2-3 weeks of lead time and shipping, about 10 hours of serious in-depth research, another week and a half of skimming forums, and about $100. If you're willing to put the time in, do it. Is there a reason why I'm not mass advertising this talk? Yes. Because if I did and I put this on blast, everybody would go do this, and this would then force up the price of vintage electronics, increase the demand of all the chips, and create a glut of systems that people would then be gouging on eBay for $400 to $500. There's a reason why people in the modding scene are very, very protective of this kind of stuff, because they want to see prices stay low, because they want to see people get into vintage gaming that are into vintage gaming so that they can enjoy it as much as they did. And I think that this doesn't come from a position of greed, because if it came from a position of greed, people would be charging $500 and $600 for systems, and they would be gatekeeping the knowledge. But in these old vintage gaming forums, and I say old, I mean 90s. I grew up with this shit, right? So don't call me a boomer and don't call me a gray muzzle. I swear, I will ban you. This isn't my channel. I'll do it in my own channel. But what I'm saying is, this is a really important thing that people have to be able to have access to. And so one of the reasons why it's kept small and this knowledge is kept super guarded is because they don't want to see prices, completely explode. And I agree with that as a member of that community. As a member of the retro gaming and retro modding community. So again, I'm happy to give this knowledge away, but this isn't something that I would market and put up on YouTube, because I want to see people who are really interested in it do the research. But also, if you have questions about this kind of stuff, or on vintage console modding, don't hesitate to hit me up, and ask me questions. Hit me up through a Twitter DM, or hit me up through my Twitch channel at RipleyViolet. Send me a whisper. and I'd be more than happy to message you and and try and help you and guide you a little bit along. But yeah, this is basically like the reason for all of this. It's the idea that you can retain an extra 70% of the video quality and also have an original experience that is, in many cases, far above and beyond the original intention of the hardware. You can, with a few small modifications, have a hot-rodded old system like this if you're willing to put the time and the energy and the effort into it. So if people have any questions, I know that we've got about 10 minutes left. Please start typing them into the live Q&A channel, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So I can also double check the other channel if people want me to check. I think that people may have put some questions in there. Okay. And if we don't get any questions, then I'll start rambling about PSPs, and that's totally fine. I do not mind. So I'll give it about a minute and a half, and then if I don't see anybody asking questions, I'll start to bring in all the information about PSPs and how you can basically jump right into that as a great introduction to vintage gaming through a video export card. Hello, M. Thank you so much for coming back. Which console is your favorite to mod? My favorite console to mod would have to be the Turbo Duo, which I'm showing you here right now. It's the one that I've done the most repairs on. The white PC Engine also, I've done a ton of repairs on these as well. I kind of happen to really love this gaming console more than any other gaming console. Pardon me. It's the one I never had access to when I was a kid. And in the early 2000s, I was able to find, by fixing them for other people and helping other people, with my repair tutorials, I was able to acquire a lot of the games, at, a relatively decent price, and also help the community out at the same time as I was doing my own repair work and my own tutorials. Because again, all of these images that you saw were part of repair tutorials that I put up years back. And in many cases, people took the repair tutorials and modified them and made them way better than I ever did. So I mean, that's the thing, is that it's, this is an ever evolving beast that just keeps getting better and better and better as more people keep adding to the idea. So I would have to say the PC Engine TurboGrafx would be my favorite. Second favorite, I'm going to only say the PSP because it was the first system that I started working on really seriously. I broke a screen on a PSP. A friend of mine gave it to me and said, "You're never going to be able to fix this." 2 days later, I had the PSP completely working with a new screen in it. What are some of your favorite mods currently available? My favorite mods on old vintage gaming systems are RGB mods, obviously, audio mods that increase the volume. So increasing, like, say, for example, the capacitor size from 33 to 45 can in some cases open up audio circuits, setting up, like, doing LED mods in cases so that, they light up and look nice. In some cases, reflowing areas that are really, really bad in old systems and setting up workarounds. There's so RGB mods, region mods, audio mods. Those are like my three favorite to do because they really hot rod the system out, and you can't really do much more than that. You mentioned replacing lasers. Would you happen to know where one might find Dreamcast or PlayStation 2 laser replacements? eBay, vintage forums, Alibaba. It's going to be a crapshoot anytime you find old lasers. I would recommend always going for, if you can find original equipment, Japanese lasers. It's kind of a crapshoot because in some cases they're 10, 15, 20 years old. You don't know if there's been any parts decay. It really just depends on how the storage of the system has been. I'd say look for the place that has the best feedback on eBay. Look for the person who sells the most stuff on Alibaba. Go directly to the source for the person and try and figure out the manufacturer and the quality of the manufacturer before you buy. But Dreamcast lasers are hard because that is a very involved laser that requires a full disassembly of the system, and in many cases, people just replace the system. So be wary when encountering that one. The PlayStation 2 is relatively easy to do. I've done about 3 or 4, and the mod chip for the PlayStation to make it play Japanese and burn games is also in backup games, folks, because you already own them. Is something that is a relatively easy fix to do. The PlayStation 2 is way easier. You can find the lasers. It's a Sony product, so you can find the lasers anywhere. The Dreamcast, that's a bit harder of an animal to work with. But if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the DEFCON First Telegram chat. Feel free to hit me up in on a Twitch Whisper or in a Twitter DM. Contacting me through Discord is a really bad idea. Were you modded by bacteria back in the day? No, I never used any modding. I don't know what bacteria is. I assume that's the name of a modder. I basically just, scoured the tutorials, talked directly with other people that were doing mods, developed my own workarounds and my own techniques for things, and started posting repair tutorials at a time in which not many people were doing that. And again, mine were not great. People released ones that were way more in depth than mine and way better than mine. But I started early enough and got into it early enough that it started to spark interest on a few forums. And I made some friends with some of the modders who were actually still active. I've been missing in action for 4 years because, college and work and all this other stuff. But, it's still a viable option that's still available. And it's still something that you can do, on a regular basis. Oh, and also when installing a switch on a region mod, make sure that when you do install a switch on a region mod, that you get your dimensions right. I cut the switch a little too far out with the Dremel tool and had to use 2-stage epoxy to fill in the area. And if it wasn't for my friend that ended up buying the system for me for $300 when I was in a pinch, I didn't really like the aesthetic of this. So make sure, like, when you do your measurements, measure twice, cut once. Don't overcut, because that can definitely be an issue. And yeah, especially when you're doing something as complex as taking, an old AV plug and removing it, so that, you have your base chipboard and then reinstalling something in it. This is an involved process, right? You're doing a lot of modding. This is an AV mod. This is something that I really enjoy doing. Is what will open up the original brilliance of these gaming systems. I really honestly wonder what half of the programmers would think if they were able to see this in the original quality, right? So so this is something that I think we all don't really think about when we start to play games. Again, I'm not at all knocking the emulator crowd. I think that they're great. I think that what they do is awesome, and I think that this opens up the world of vintage gaming for people. But if you want to take it a logical step further, and you want to be a hardware hacker, this is the way to go about doing it. All the information is available at your fingertips. You just have to put the time and a little bit of money into tools. You can do this with some lead-free, acid-free solder. It has to be lead-free, acid-free, electronic safe. A bunch of 18 gauge, 20 to 28 gauge wire, and the capacitors that you need, plus a chip, that in many cases is pre-designed. Now, for all you crazy hardware hackers out there that want to take it a logical step further, you can even get the electrical design schematics for a lot of these old systems. You can get the literal electrical schematic that has the traces for each of the chipboards on the front and the back that will tell you where to go for everything. CR102 runs the laser. CR104 runs the tracking. CR107 runs this and that. You can find the entire pull-out schematics for this. And if you want to get even nerdier, like I have once or twice, you can buy your own breadboard and build your own chip. Now, is this something that I recommend everybody do? Do you want to? Do you want to spend the time building your own chips? I would assume that half of the people that are in this chat right now that are looking at the DEFCON badges, that are literally doing their own soldering and welding, would say, why should I buy a chip for $35 when I can build my own chip? That information is available to you too. If you want to literally want to take the upgraded version. You can do it that way too. You can put in the extra work. Will the sense of self-satisfaction be even more? Yes. Will you get extra kudos from all the modders for building your own chips? Yes, that will happen. Quite possibly, will you drive yourself crazy doing it and break something? Definitely. So we've got less than a minute. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to give me the opportunity to talk about all these vintage gaming systems that I really enjoy and love. You know, the PC Engine, the Turbo Duo, and and the TurboGrafx 16, and the PSP, which is a great intro because you can literally just plug and play and start playing all of these old games. But for those of you that want to take it that extra step, it's there for you. The power is in your hands. With a little bit of ingenuity, with a little bit of solder, with a lot of sweat and swearing, and potentially, a shot of tequila, or, a bit of that legal, tobacco, you'll get through it. And, and you don't need, AIDS to do that either, like Monster Energy drink or Red Bull or any of the things that I mentioned beforehand. What you need is dedication, the willingness to do this, the want to play vintage games, and the patience to go through one of these systems and build it right. Build it once, build it right, and then you will have the ultimate gaming experience from the 8, 6, and 16-bit gaming days. So again, folks, my name is RipleyViolet. I'm signing off. You can find me at Ripley Storm on Twitter, at RipleyViolet on Picarto, Twitch, for Affinity, pretty much everywhere else. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for being such amazing folks. I appreciate you all. I love you all. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat with you all today. Please give my Twitch and Twitter a follow. Watch me on For Affinity. And thank you to the DEFCON First for giving me this wonderful platform to talk about hyper nerdy vintage electronics and how that relates to the streaming world and how it can upgrade your system and turbocharge it and turbocharge your stream better than any emulator ever could. Thanks a lot. I appreciate all of your help and all of your patience and all of you watching today.